February 3rd, 1945. A Remington typewriter in a requisition schoolhouse outside Metz struck 4 words through a sheet of carbon paper, unsuitable for field command. The page came out warm from the machine. The clerk lifted it, the major signed it, and a decorated American sergeant's future disappeared into a folder before the ink had even dried. Outside, the road was frozen black. A Filipino American staff sergeant named Rafael Abad was running across that road with a radio battery under one arm and a box of plasma under the other, because 9 wounded men were pinned behind a stone wall, and the surgeon who could save them was 6 miles away. Inside, Major Vernon Pike had never treated a man under shell fire. He had never crawled across a mined orchard. He had never tried to explain morphine dosage in broken French to a terrified civilian family while German artillery walked closer by the minute. But he had a desk, and in that winter, a desk could kill a soldier's career as cleanly as a machine gun. This is the story of the sergeant the army almost buried under paperwork, the officer who called his accent a command risk, the captain who refused to let the file die, and the general who walked into the map room and proved, without shouting, that the wrong man had been wearing authority all along. By the time it was over, one promotion form would change the way forward medical teams moved through the last months of the war. But before the order was signed, before the major's name was stripped from every promotion panel in the sector, before Rafael Abad crawled into a drainage culvert and saved a battalion from bleeding itself empty in the dark, it began with a typewriter. Winter in Lorraine did not look like victory. The newspapers back home showed arrows moving across maps. They showed liberated villages and smiling children and generals standing beside tanks. They did not show the roads. The roads were where the war actually lived. They were narrow, iced-over, cratered, and bordered by stone walls that trapped the cold like a curse. Convoys slipped into ditches. Ambulances moved without headlights. Stretcher teams learned to count shell bursts the way other men counted church bells. By early 1945, the American advance had become fast enough to create its own kind of danger. Combat units were pushing forward faster than the medical and administrative systems could settle behind them. A field hospital might be close in the morning and too far by nightfall. A battalion aid station might have a surgeon, but no plasma. Another might have plasma but no working radio. Another might have both, but no one who could speak to the French mayor whose cellar was the only dry room left in town. In the old version of field medicine, the job of an enlisted medic was simple. Stop the bleeding, give morphine, move the wounded man rearward. But this war had outrun that simplicity. The men at the front needed decisions made at the point of injury. They needed somebody who could triage under fire, call artillery coordinates, reroute ambulances around blown bridges, talk to civilians, read a map, repair a radio, and decide which man had 12 minutes and which man had 2. On paper, that authority belonged to officers. In the mud, it often belonged to whoever was competent enough to survive the question. Staff Sergeant Rafael Abad had been surviving that question for almost 2 years. He was born in Stockton, California in 1918, the son of a Filipino cannery worker and a mother who had learned nursing from Catholic sisters before the family came north. His father spoke Ilocano at the kitchen table and English at the hiring gate. His mother spoke softly, but she could stop a bleeding cut with a dish towel and one hard look. Rafael grew up in a house where language was not decoration, it was survival. You spoke one way to the foreman, another way to the priest, another way to the white landlord who could raise rent without looking you in the eye, another way to a grandmother whose cough had changed overnight. By 17, Rafael could fix a radio set with borrowed wire. By 19, he was working nights at the cannery and taking classes in anatomy and electrical repair at a junior college. He did not know yet whether he wanted to become a doctor or an engineer. The Army made the decision easier and harder at the same time. It put him in a medical battalion because he understood blood loss. Then it put him near radios because he understood circuits. Then it discovered that a man who could do both was more useful than the forms knew how to describe. By the time he reached France, Rafael had become the kind of soldier officers trusted before they admitted they trusted him. He could hear panic in a radio voice and know whether the caller was losing men or losing nerve. He could look at a casualty and tell whether the man needed a surgeon now or could survive the next ambulance. He could ask an old French farmer where the German shells usually landed and understand the answer well enough to move an aid station 50 yards before the next barrage arrived. His evaluations were almost insulting in how consistent they were. Top 5% in field problem solving. Top 10% in medical competency. Repeated commendations for courage under fire. Documented coordination of civilian cellars, church basements, farm wagons, and signal relays during evacuation operations. 31 men had lived because Rafael made the right decision before anyone with rank could be reached. Not 31 men treated, not 31 men moved, 31 men who, according to battalion surgeons, would have died before reaching the rear if Rafael Abad had not been there. And still 4 promotion recommendations came back denied. The first denial said he lacked officer bearing. The second said his speech pattern could create confusion under combat stress. The third said he relied too heavily on local language intermediaries. The fourth was typed on February 3, 1945. Unsuitable for field command. 4 words. Clean paper. Dirty work. The man behind those words was Major Vernon Pike. Pike had served in uniform for 13 years and had arranged all 13 of them around clean floors. He was not stupid. He was not openly wild with hatred. That would have been easier to identify and easier to remove. Pike's talent was making prejudice look like procedure. He did not write Filipino. He wrote communication reliability. He did not write accent. He wrote command clarity. He did not write, not one of us. He wrote unsuitable for field command. And because he used the right language, the wrong decision kept surviving. Captain Ruth Harlan saw it before anyone with stars did. Harlan was a surgical nurse before the war, then a medical administrative officer because the Army needed women who could do impossible work while pretending it was clerical. She had seen Rafael bring men in who should have been dead. She had seen surgeons stop arguing when he gave a casualty sequence. She had watched him turn a terrified French schoolteacher into an evacuation guide because he spoke to her like she was part of the solution, not part of the scenery. So when Pike denied the 4th recommendation, Harlan did something that officers like Pike counted on people not doing. She made a duplicate file, not a summary, not a complaint, a full duplicate. Evaluations, surgeon statements, evacuation logs, radio repair records, a handwritten note from a French village priest saying Raphael's French had allowed 18 wounded civilians and soldiers to be moved before the church roof collapsed. At 08:30, Harlan placed the official file on Pike's desk. At 08:45, she sent the duplicate by courier to Army headquarters with a cover memo that used the one phrase nobody in a winter offensive could ignore: operational readiness risk. Pike read only the name tab. Abad again, he said. Harlan stood across from him without moving. Yes, sir. Pike slid the recommendation closer with 2 fingers, as if the paper itself was unpleasant. Captain, the Army is not a charity for talented enlisted men who want decorations turned into commissions. No, sir, Harlan said. It is an army, which is why competence should matter. Pike looked up. Do not mistake field usefulness for command suitability. Harlan opened her folder. His forward team reduced average evacuation time in our sector from 48 minutes to 22. 3 battalion surgeons signed the attachment. 2 company commanders asked for him by name. The signal officer credits him with restoring radio contact during the Marange Road collapse. Pike tapped the page. I am aware of the claims. You haven't read them. A clerk at the next desk stopped typing. Pike's face did not change, but his voice cooled. Captain Harlan. She knew she had crossed the line. She crossed it again. Major, he speaks English, Ilocano, working French, and enough German to read road signs under fire. You are denying him for communication reliability. I am denying him because men must understand orders instantly. They do. Men like Sergeant Abad create uncertainty. No, sir, Harlan said. Men like Sergeant Abad create results. The room went quiet enough to hear the stovepipe ticking. Pike wrote his signature on the denial, slow and precise. Recommendation rejected. Harlan picked up the file. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She said, I expected that answer. Pike's pen stopped. Harlan continued. A duplicate has already gone to headquarters. If they agree with you, this ends today. If they do not, it ends somewhere else. Pike stood up. On whose authority? Harlan held his eyes. Mine. The courier reached headquarters before noon. What happened in the hour after the file arrived was never written into a formal report. Men rarely write down the moment a machine begins to turn against itself. But a staff aide later remembered the commanding general reading the packet once, then again. He remembered the general setting the pages flat on the map table and placing both palms on either side of them. He did not curse. That was what made the room afraid. At 12:50, 3 jeeps stopped outside the requisition schoolhouse. Boots hit the ice. A door opened without a knock. Every officer in the room snapped to attention. General Thomas Hartwell walked in carrying the duplicate file in his left hand. Hartwell was not a theatrical man. He did not need ivory pistols or profanity to make a room smaller. He had the tired face of a commander who had watched enough good men die to resent any system that wasted the living. He looked at Pike first, then at Harlan, then at Rafael Abad, who had been summoned from the aid station with his sleeves still stained dark at the cuffs. Hartwell placed the folder on Pike's desk. "Major Pike, sir, you have denied Staff Sergeant Abad's commission 4 times. On documented administrative grounds, sir. The most recent ground is field command suitability." "Yes, sir." Hartwell nodded once. "Then we will test field command." He turned to the map board. The board showed the current advance. Villages marked in grease pencil, bridges marked in red, roadblocks marked with pins, aid stations marked with little blue tabs. Hartwell pulled one operational order from the folder and handed it to Pike. "Read the order aloud, then plot the evacuation route." Pike took the paper. His gloves were too clean. He began well enough. Then he reached the name of a village east of the Moselle and stumbled. He tried again. Wrong. A few men in the room knew the name. Most of them had been mispronouncing it for a week. Hartwell said, "Continue." Pike continued. He misread a road designation. He placed the relay point on the wrong side of a blown bridge. He routed 2 ambulances through a village that had been under observed fire since dawn. Hartwell let him finish. Then the general said, "Sergeant Abad." Rafael stepped forward. "Sir, same order." Rafael took the paper. He read it in clean, calm English, not fast, not loud. Every grid coordinate correct. Every village name pronounced close enough that the French liaison at the back of the room lifted his head. Then he turned to the map. "Primary route is unusable, sir. Bridge here is out. German observers are on this ridge, which means the road through Saint-Avold is lit by artillery after dark. Ambulances should move south through the quarry road, but only in pairs, because the turn at the mill will not take a full convoy." Hartwell asked, "Relay point?" "Church cellar in Varney. Stone walls, 2 entrances. Civilian mayor has 3 wagons. He will cooperate if asked in French, not shouted at in English." A silence opened. Hartwell looked at Pike. "Major, translate the order into any second language used in this sector." Pike stared at him. "Sir, I do not speak a second language." Hartwell's voice dropped. "You denied a soldier a commission because his communication was a risk." No one moved. Hartwell continued. "He can read the order, correct the route, coordinate with civilians, repair the radio relay, and give the same instruction in 2 languages that matter here. You can read 1 language and still send ambulances through a dead bridge." Pike swallowed. "Sir, with respect, this is an irregular proceeding." "It is," Hartwell said. "So is dying because a clerk with rank thinks an accent is a defect." He pointed to the promotion form. "Sign it." Pike did not move. Hartwell said, "You may sign that commission now, or you may explain to a board why your definition of command suitability excludes the man who understands the battlefield better than the officer judging him." Pike reached for his pen. His signature was not as neat as the denial had been. Hartwell took the paper, looked at it, and handed it to Captain Harlan. Then he removed Pike's nameplate from the front of the desk. It was a small brass plate, 2 screws, 1 scraping sound as it came loose. Hartwell set it face down. "Major Pike is relieved of promotion review authority in this sector, effective immediately." Outside the windows, enlisted men had gathered in the snow. They did not cheer. They knew better. But they watched Pike walk out carrying 1 canvas bag, and every man there understood what had happened. A room that had been allowed to judge in private had finally been watched. By sunset, Staff Sergeant Rafael Abad was First Lieutenant Rafael Abad. The silver bars were cold when Harlan placed them in his hand. He looked at them for a long time. Then he said, "There are still men at the quarry road." Harlan smiled once. "Then go, Lieutenant," and he went. Justice feels complete when the wrong man leaves the room. It rarely is. Within 48 hours, headquarters received 5 more files that looked too much like Rafael's. A Choctaw engineer denied for temperament. An Italian American signal sergeant denied for voice discipline. A black motor pool chief denied for limited command presence after keeping an evacuation route open for 36 hours. 2 Mexican American medics whose recommendations had vanished between battalion and personnel review. The names changed. The language changed. The room was the same. Hartwell could not drive to every command post in the Army. He was commanding an offensive, not a courtroom. But he understood the failure now. 1 officer in a closed room could turn bias into policy if the form looked official enough. So he ordered Captain Ruth Harlan and a young legal officer named Lieutenant Miriam Keene to build a review system that no single desk could own. Keene was 29, sharp-eyed, and already disliked by men who discovered too late that she read every paragraph of every regulation they quoted. She did not argue loudly. She simply opened the book to the part they had skipped. Her proposal was 8 pages. A rotating review panel, mandatory combat performance evidence, automatic conflict of interest removal, direct reporting to headquarters. Every denial required to identify the operational standard being failed, not just the impression being disliked. Hartwell signed it at 23:05 hours. By morning, copies moved through every personnel channel in the sector. Pike's old office received one at breakfast. Nobody there touched the typewriter for almost 10 minutes. The first panel met in a classroom with broken windows and a coal stove that smoked every time the wind shifted. 5 cases, 7 officers, 2 enlisted technical witnesses, 1 legal officer who treated vague language like unexploded ordnance. The Choctaw engineer was approved in 32 minutes. The Italian American signal sergeant took longer, because one colonel insisted that officers needed a clear American voice. Keene asked him to define that phrase using Army regulations. He could not. Promotion approved. The black motor pool chief was challenged on the grounds that his authority over white drivers might cause friction. Harlan read aloud the convoy log showing that the same white drivers had requested him by name after he repaired a fuel choke under mortar fire. Promotion approved. By the end of the first week, the panel had reviewed 16 cases. 13 were approved. 3 were returned for missing field evidence. 0 were denied for accent, surname, or the soft little phrases men used when they wanted prejudice to look professional. The system did not become fair because good men wished it fair. It became fairer because someone took away the locked room. But systems do not surrender quietly. The resistance moved underground. A colonel who had worked with Pike began forwarding complaints that the new officers were overconfident. Another officer argued that accelerated commissions damaged morale among men who had followed the proper path. A personnel clerk lost 2 witness statements. 1 panel packet arrived with the wrong casualty log attached. Keene caught the log switch because the dates were impossible. The supposed January report referenced a bridge that had not been captured until February. She wrote 1 sentence in the margin. This error is either incompetent or intentional. Hartwell circled the sentence and wrote beneath it, "Find out which." The answer became less important 3 days later, when the Germans found their own reason to care. By mid-February, German units opposite the American line had begun noticing a change. American evacuation patterns were faster. Radio relays recovered sooner. Civilian road information reached forward units with less delay. Bridges were assessed and bypassed before artillery could close the trap. Wounded men who should have remained in the field until daylight were disappearing into cellars, wagons, and ambulances before German observers could adjust fire. At first, German intelligence assumed new equipment. Then they captured an administrative pouch after shelling a courier jeep near a crossroads. Inside were 2 panel directives and a personnel list with several newly commissioned officers marked for forward medical or engineering duties. A German staff officer wrote a short assessment that moved through the enemy line faster than any American denial ever had. The improvement was personnel-driven. Not machines, not luck, people. The American system had begun putting its most capable field operators in positions where their decisions mattered. That made those operators targets. Rafael learned it at ZO 410 on February 19th. His aid relay was set up inside a stone dairy barn outside a village whose name most Americans butchered and every local child could say perfectly. The barn had 2 thick walls, a loft, and a floor packed hard enough for stretchers. It was not comfortable. It was exactly what they needed. The first mortar landed short. The second landed closer. The third hit the empty orchard behind the barn. Rafael froze for half a second listening. Then he shouted, "Move the relay." One corporal looked up. "Sir, they're ranging on the crossroads." "No," Rafael said. "They're walking toward the barn." He had heard it in the spacing. He had seen it in the orchard burst. Someone had the wrong target for a normal barrage and the right target for his station. The team moved in 9 minutes, radio first, plasma second, wounded third, maps last. The 4th shell hit the barn roof just as the last stretcher cleared the lower door. The loft came down in a burst of tile, dust, and old hay. Rafael had waited for confirmation. 7 men would have died under it. He filed the report in the same language he used for everything else. Enemy fire adjusted onto forward aid relay. Relocated before direct hit. No loss of patience. Harlan read the line and knew what it meant. Keene read it and sent a copy to intelligence. Hartwell read it and said nothing for almost a full minute. Then he asked, "How many of the panel's officers are forward?" "Most of them," Harlan said. "Of course they are," Hartwell said. "That's why they mattered." The room understood the problem. The old system had hidden these men from responsibility. The new system had exposed them to the enemy. That is the price of using competence in a war. It saves more lives. It also moves the target onto the people doing the saving. For Rafael, the worst night came 3 weeks later. March 9, 1945, a rail viaduct outside Kreutzwald. The town was not famous. It was not supposed to decide anything. It was one more hard place on a map full of hard places. But the viaduct controlled a road, and the road controlled the evacuation route for 2 infantry companies pushing into the factory district beyond it. By 0200, the attack had gone wrong. German machine guns held the far embankment. A mortar team was firing from behind a coal shed. 2 platoons were pinned in the open ground near the tracks. The aid station was 400 yards back and useless to any man who could not crawl. The wounded began stacking up in the dark, first 5, then 12, then more. Radio contact broke twice. The stretcher team sent across the road came back with 1 man missing and another shot through the thigh. A captain on the line requested smoke. The artillery liaison could not see the guns. The Germans could see everything. Rafael stood behind a broken signal truck and listened to the battlefield. That was one of the things men misunderstood about him. They thought he translated words. He translated patterns, the burst length of a machine gun, the delay between mortar rounds, the way a wounded man called for his mother in English, Spanish, Polish, or no language at all. The difference between confusion and collapse. At 0217 he told his team, "I'm going under the track bed." A corporal said, "Sir, there's water in that culvert, then I'll be wet." The Germans can see the opening. Not from the coal shed, the angle is wrong. Nobody argued after that. Rafael took a medical bag, a field phone handset, 2 morphine syrettes, and a coil of wire. He left his helmet net behind because it kept catching on stone. Then he dropped into the drainage ditch and crawled. The water was black and high enough to soak his chest. The stones cut his palms. Twice, shell bursts shook dirt from the sides of the culvert. Once, a flare lit the far opening white, and Rafael pressed his face into freezing water until the light died. He reached the first wounded man at 0224. Private. 18, maybe 19. Arterial bleeding from the upper leg. Rafael clamped pressure with one hand and tied with the other, feeling for the pulse in the dark. The boy kept saying he could not feel his foot. "That means you're alive enough to complain," Rafael whispered. The boy laughed once, then cried. Rafael marked him with a strip of torn bandage and crawled on. The second man had a sucking chest wound. Rafael sealed it with rubber cut from a ration packet and tape that barely held in the cold. He waited until the breath changed. Not good. Better. The third man was not wounded. He was a radio operator curled behind a broken rail tie, too terrified to raise the handset. Rafael put a hand on his shoulder. "Give me the line." The operator shook his head. "They'll cut us in half. Give me the line." The boy gave him the handset. Rafael listened to the machine gun pattern for 11 seconds. Then he spoke. "Relay to artillery. 2 guns. First gun, north embankment, 30 yards right of the signal post. Second gun, coal shed rear door. Mortar crew behind the shed, not inside it. Fire high angle. Walk 1 round short, 1 round long, then bracket center." The operator stared. "You can see them?" "No," Rafael said. "I can hear what they're using." 4 minutes later, the first American shell landed short. The second landed long. The third landed behind the coal shed. The fourth silenced the mortar. The 2 machine guns stopped within the next 30 seconds. The absence of fire was so sudden that men did not move at first. Then Rafael stood up in the open ground and waved the stretcher teams forward. For the next 50 minutes, his team worked in a strip of frozen rail yard that had been impossible to cross an hour earlier. They treated 22 wounded men. 17 were evacuated alive who would not have survived until daylight. 2 officers lived long enough to keep their companies organized. 1 engineer squad reached the viaduct supports and found the demolition wire before the Germans could fire the charges. By 0400, the road beyond Kreutzwald was open. By dawn, ambulances were moving through it. By the following night, the German pocket west of the river had lost its clean retreat route. No single man wins a battle alone. That is children's history. But some men become the hinge on which a much larger door turns. Rafael Abad's crawl through that drainage culvert did not end the war. It did something smaller and more important. It proved that the thing Major Pike had called a defect was part of the reason the line kept moving. Not just language, not just courage, not just medical skill, integration. The ability to connect what the army had separated into boxes. Medicine signals, civilian knowledge, map reading, fire patterns, human fear, command decision. Pike had looked at Rafael and seen a man who did not fit the form. The battlefield had looked at Rafael and found the missing form. After Kreutzwald, requests for Rafael-trained relay teams multiplied. Not because headquarters issued a beautiful statement, not because prejudice vanished, not because officers suddenly became better men, because wounded soldiers talked. A man who had been saved behind the tracks told a driver. The driver told an aid station. The aid station told a surgeon. The surgeon told a battalion commander that if he was going forward again, he wanted one of Abad's people near the radios. The Army has official channels. It also has the channels men use when they are trying not to die. By April, the review panel had processed 28 cases. 22 commissions were approved. 4 were delayed for evidence. 2 were rejected for reasons that survived review. That mattered. The point was never to approve every man. The point was to stop denying the right ones because the wrong officer owned the room. Lieutenant Miriam Keene wrote the final policy memo in dry language. Forward technical competence must be evaluated through documented operational outcome, not subjective cultural impression. It was not a poetic sentence. It was a weapon. It meant a clerk could no longer bury a soldier's future by saying he did not sound like command. He had to prove the soldier could not command. There is a difference. And in war, that difference has a body count. When Germany surrendered, Rafael was not at a parade. He was in a schoolhouse that had become a field clinic, changing the dressing on a German boy, whose arm had been torn open by shrapnel 2 days before the end. The child did not know what side Rafael was on. He only knew the man with the tired eyes spoke gently and made the pain smaller. Someone outside began ringing a bell. A corporal came in and said, "Sir, it's over." Rafael tied the bandage, checked the knot and said, "For him, not yet." That was how he understood endings, not as announcements, as work that still had to be finished. The Army offered him a permanent commission after the war. He declined. He returned to California, finished medical school on benefits and borrowed money, and opened a clinic near the neighborhoods where cannery workers still came home smelling of metal, fish, peaches, and fatigue. He kept his silver bars in a small wooden box in the top drawer of his desk. Not on display, not framed, not polished for visitors. His daughter once asked him why he kept them hidden. Rafael said, "Because they are not proof that I became something. They are proof someone finally stopped pretending I wasn't already doing it." Captain Ruth Harlan left the Army and spent the next 20 years in hospital administration, where she became very good at recognizing rooms where one person with a pen could decide too much. Lieutenant Miriam Keene became a judge after the war. Former clerks described her as courteous, exact, and impossible to frighten with procedure. Major Vernon Pike spent the remainder of his service in supply assignment far from promotion authority. He never wrote a public account of what happened in that schoolhouse. Men like him often don't. Their version of history depends on nobody asking what the words on their forms really meant. General Hartwell's directives survived in fragments. Copies in personal papers, quotes in training memos, references in later medical evacuation doctrine. The Army did what institutions often do when an embarrassing correction proves useful. It absorbed the lesson and sanded off the names. The forward relay model spread because it worked. Decision authority closer to the wound. Medical teams trained to coordinate with signals. Language skill treated as operational capability. Field evidence required before subjective denial. Years later, younger soldiers would learn pieces of the system without ever hearing Rafael Abad's name. They would learn that minutes matter, that the first competent decision may matter more than the perfect decision made too late, that a civilian who speaks the road may save more lives than a map, that the person closest to the blood often understands the battle before the person farthest from it. They would learn the doctrine. They would not always learn the insult that almost kept the doctrine from happening. That is the part worth remembering. The danger was not only Major Pike. A small man with a typewriter can do damage, but only if the room lets him. The danger was the room. The door closed, the standard vague, the evidence optional, the language polished enough to hide the rot, the file moving downward instead of outward. The good officers too busy, too tired, or too trained to respect the chain that was choking the truth. Every organization has a Rafael Abad. Not the same uniform, not the same war, not the same wound. But someone whose competence is obvious to the people near the work and invisible to the people guarding the gate. Someone who does the job before the title arrives. Someone whose difference gets named as risk by men who cannot match the results. Someone whose file comes back denied so often that everyone starts treating the denial as weather. And every organization has a room like Pike's. A place where clean language covers dirty judgment. A place where fit means familiar. A place where standards means comfort. A place where one person can confuse his own limits with the limits of somebody else. The lesson is not that a general saved a sergeant. That is too simple. The lesson is that Captain Harlan made a copy. Lieutenant Keene changed the rule. Rafael Abad kept doing the work. And the general, when the proof reached his table, understood that fairness was not charity. It was combat efficiency. It was institutional survival. It was the difference between a dead bridge and a living road. 4 words tried to bury him. Unsuitable for field command. The war answered with a map route, a radio line, a drainage culvert. 22 wounded men pulled out before sunrise. And a lifetime of doctrine built around the thing he had been doing all along. The Army almost mistook his voice for the problem. Then it spent the rest of its future teaching soldiers to listen the way he did.